The protagonist had always enjoyed the quiet hum of suburban life in their charming little neighborhood, where everything seemed to move at a slower pace. There were no rushing cars or people running late. It was the kind of place where everyone waved hello and kids played freely in their front yards. The protagonist spent mornings with a cup of coffee watching the sun rise over the backyard, feeling a sense of peace. They could always count on the calm and serenity of the neighborhood life. Everything seemed perfect until the day the new neighbors moved in. It was a bright Saturday morning when the moving truck appeared at the house next door. The protagonist had seen the house listed for months and wondered who would be the new owners. Now, as the truck pulled into the driveway, the protagonist stood by the window sipping coffee and watching the scene unfold, curious about who would soon be living right next door. The door of the truck opened, and out stepped a woman with a clipboard in one hand and a bright smile on her face. She looked over at the house next door, and then at the neighboring homes, before striding toward the front door. As if she were on a mission, the moving crew began unloading boxes and furniture, and the woman continued her survey of the property. The protagonist couldn't help but notice the woman's meticulousness as she checked off items on her clipboard and occasionally glanced over at the neighboring houses. She didn't seem to be just checking the layout of her new home. There was something more to it, an air of authority mixed with an overenthusiastic attention to detail. The protagonist watched for a while, wondering if this woman was perhaps just another detail-oriented neighbor. But then something strange happened. The woman's eyes met theirs from across the fence. Her smile never faltered. But there was a glint of something else in her gaze, something calculating. Over the next few days, the new neighbor was everywhere, it seemed, as if she were always walking around the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, or chatting with other homeowners about this, or that. Her presence was undeniable, and every conversation she started made it clear she was no ordinary resident. The protagonist learned quickly that she was an active member of the Homeowners Association, the very association that had a reputation for enforcing the rules of the neighborhood with unwavering zeal. The HOA Karen, as the protagonist started calling her in their mind, quickly earned her place as the go-to person for anything and everything concerning the neighborhood. If a fence was painted the wrong color or a lawn wasn't mowed in time, the Karen was the one to report it. Her focus on order and detail began to feel stifling, and the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful life was being slowly encroached upon. One afternoon, the protagonist was in the backyard enjoying the sun when they noticed the Karen peering over the fence with an unusual intensity. Her eyes locked on the garden and then swept across the yard with a keen observance that felt invasive. The protagonist waved politely, but the Karen didn't wave back. Instead, she continued to observe with an almost calculating air, as if measuring the space between their property and hers. At that moment, the protagonist realized this wouldn't just be another quiet neighborly relationship. This woman wasn't here to make casual conversation or share gardening tips. She was here to enforce her own brand of order, whether others wanted it or not. The protagonist couldn't know yet how deep her control would run, but one thing was certain: the neighborhood was about to change in ways they hadn't expected. And the first sign was already there in the Karen's determined gaze. The following days were filled with an unsettling tension, as the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that their private space was being slowly scrutinized. The Karen was everywhere, always walking along the sidewalks, peering at the neighbors' homes, or chatting up other residents about the latest HOA business. She was constantly talking about rules and regulations, whether it was about lawn height or the color of mailbox posts. There was no escaping the constant reminders of her presence. The protagonist began to notice the Karen's gaze lingering a little longer each time their paths crossed. A quick glance at the front yard or a lingering look at the backyard. It was as if the Karen was always sizing things up in a way that felt more like an inspection than casual observation. The protagonist tried to dismiss it as paranoia. After all, she was just a concerned neighbor, but deep down something about it didn't sit right. One evening, while relaxing in the backyard, the protagonist heard the sound of footsteps on the other side of the fence. They turned their head to see the Karen standing there with her eyes fixed on the yard again. Her expression was unreadable, as she stood just beyond the wooden fence, peering over it, as if trying to take in every corner of the space. The protagonist stood frozen for a moment, before politely waving and saying a quick hello. The Karen offered a small smile, but her eyes never left the backyard. A strange feeling of being watched washed over the protagonist as they realized the Karen had been taking these long glances at the yard for weeks now, sometimes lingering for minutes at a time. When the protagonist was inside the house, they couldn't shake the sensation that the Karen was always out there keeping an eye on things. Then came the day the protagonist noticed something even more troubling. It was a warm afternoon when they first saw it. A shiny black camera mounted on the side of the Karen's house facing directly into their backyard. The camera was positioned high on the wall and barely noticeable from a distance, but up close it was impossible to miss the understated lens staring right at their property. The protagonist froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. Was this really happening? Had the Karen gone as far as to install security cameras facing their private yard? The feeling of unease deepened as the protagonist stood there staring at the camera, wondering if it had always been there or if it had just been recently installed. Either way, it felt invasive. It felt like an invasion of their privacy. But what could they do about it? The protagonist tried to brush it off at first, telling themselves it was just a security measure that the Karen had installed for her own peace of mind. But deep down, they knew this was more than just about safety. That evening, the protagonist sat in the living room, unable to stop thinking about the camera staring into their backyard. It wasn't just a camera anymore. It felt like an ever-present eye, watching their every move, their every action. The sense of control that the Karen seemed to have over the neighborhood had suddenly become personal. It wasn't just about the lawn or the fence anymore. It was about their very space, their privacy. As the protagonist mulled over their growing discomfort, they couldn't help but wonder what the Karen's true intentions were, and whether this camera was just the beginning of something far more intrusive. It was clear that the once peaceful suburban neighborhood had begun to shift into something else, and the Karen's presence was at the heart of it all. The protagonist couldn't ignore the camera any longer. The lens that once seemed like a small detail now felt like an uninvited intruder, hanging over their every move as they sat in their backyard, enjoying a quiet evening. The blinking red light of the camera caught their attention again. It felt as if it was watching them, tracking their every motion. The calm they once enjoyed was now shattered and replaced by an uneasy sense of being observed. They tried to carry on as usual, pretending like the camera wasn't there, but it became increasingly difficult. Every time they went outside, the camera seemed to follow them wherever they went in the yard. Even when they were simply watering the plants or sitting on the porch, they couldn't shake the feeling that someone was constantly keeping tabs on them. Determined to get answers, the protagonist waited for the next opportunity to confront the Karen. They didn't want to start a fight, but they couldn't let this invasion of privacy continue any longer. It had already gone too far, and they knew it was time to say something. It was a few days later when the moment finally came. The Karen was outside trimming her hedges on her side of the fence. The protagonist took a deep breath, walked over to the fence, and called out to her. The Karen looked up with a bright smile that quickly faded when she saw the serious expression on the protagonist's face. "Hey there," the protagonist said, forcing a smile. "I noticed something strange recently, and I just wanted to ask you about it." The Karen stopped trimming the hedge and turned to face them. Her smile returned, but it was tight and uncertain. "Oh, of course, what's on your mind?" The protagonist pointed toward the camera mounted on the side of the house. "I was just wondering about that camera. It seems to be pointed directly into my backyard." The Karen's expression shifted ever so slightly, but she quickly regained composure. "Oh, that," she said, as if it were nothing. "I just installed it for security reasons, you know, just to make sure everything around here stays safe." The protagonist narrowed their eyes. "Security reasons? In my backyard?" The Karen hesitated for a second before answering. "Well, it's just a precaution. I've had some issues in the neighborhood recently, and I figured it would be helpful to keep an eye on things." The protagonist wasn't buying it. "You're telling me you put a camera facing my backyard for security reasons, but you've never even spoken to me about it?" The Karen's smile tightened even further, and for a moment it felt like the calm exterior she had maintained was cracking. "It's really nothing to worry about, just a way to keep an eye on the area," she said quickly. "I promise it's not an issue." The protagonist felt their frustration rising. I don't want to be rude, but it's not just nothing, it's an invasion of my privacy. I don't need a camera watching me in my own yard. The Karen's eyes narrowed as if assessing the situation. I don't see what the problem is, she said in a calm but clipped voice. I'm just trying to keep everyone safe around here. The tension hung in the air for a long moment, the protagonist's anger bubbling up. But they knew this wasn't going to be solved with a casual conversation. They needed to take further action if they were going to get the Karen to understand how unacceptable this was. I'll be contacting the HOA about this, the protagonist said firmly. This isn't something I'm willing to let slide. The Karen's smile returned. But it was colder now. You do what you have to do, she said before turning back to her hedges and pretending like the conversation had never happened. The protagonist stood there for a moment staring at the camera and wondering what their next move should be. The battle for their privacy had officially begun, and they knew that they would need to take a stand before it escalated any further. The next few days passed with an unsettling quietness. The protagonist couldn't shake the image of the camera looming over their backyard like a constant presence. It felt like every moment spent outside was under scrutiny. The usual comfort of their space was now tainted by the thought that someone was watching them, whether they were sitting on the porch reading or simply enjoying the afternoon sun. They couldn't escape the feeling of being observed. Determined to get the issue resolved, the protagonist started doing some research. They knew the Karen wasn't likely to back down on her own, so they began looking into the laws about privacy and surveillance in their state. They found that installing a camera facing someone's private property without permission was indeed illegal. It was considered a violation of privacy and could result in serious consequences. The more they read, the more they realized the Karen had crossed a line. The protagonist felt a sense of vindication, knowing that the law was on their side, but they also felt a growing frustration at how much this woman had already disrupted their life. They had always enjoyed their privacy, their space, but now it felt as though the Karen had taken that away from them with a simple camera mounted on the side of her house. That night, the protagonists decided to take action. They weren't going to just let this slide. They would contact the HOA and report the issue, hoping that the association would step in and do something about it. But they also knew it wasn't going to be easy. The Karen had too much influence in the community, and they weren't sure if the HOA would actually take their complaint seriously. The next morning, the protagonists sat down at their computer and drafted a formal complaint to the HOA, outlining the issue with the camera and explaining the legal concerns. They included the research they had done and even attached pictures of the camera to make their case as clear as possible. They clicked send with a sense of resolve, but also a nervous knot in their stomach. Days passed without any response from the HOA, and the protagonist began to wonder if they would ever hear back from them. Meanwhile, the camera continued to stare down into their yard day after day. The protagonist found it harder and harder to ignore it. One afternoon, as they sat in the living room, the phone rang. It was the HOA office. The protagonist's heart raced as they picked up the phone, ready to discuss the situation. "Hello, this is Rebecca from the HOA. The voice on the other end said, "I'm calling about your complaint regarding the security camera." The protagonist explained the situation again and waited anxiously for the HOA's response. "Well, we've reviewed the complaint," Rebecca said, "and after consulting with the Karen, we understand that the camera was installed with the intention of providing neighborhood security." The protagonist could hardly believe what they were hearing. "But it's facing my private backyard. That's a violation of my privacy," they said. Rebecca sighed. "We understand your concern, but the Karen insists that the camera is only for safety purposes, and she believes it is in line with the HOA's guidelines." The protagonist felt their blood pressure rise. "This isn't just about guidelines. This is about my rights, my privacy. I'm being watched in my own backyard, and that's illegal." The conversation went back and forth as the protagonist tried to make their case, while Rebecca repeatedly defended the Karen's actions. Eventually, the HOA concluded that they would not take any immediate action, but they encouraged the protagonist to resolve the matter directly with the Karen. The call ended and the protagonist sat there staring at the phone in disbelief. The HOA wasn't going to help. They were on their own now. it was clear the Karen wasn't going to back down, and the HOA wasn't interested in getting involved. Frustrated but not defeated, the protagonists decided to take things into their own hands. It was time to escalate the situation further. They couldn't allow this violation of their privacy to continue, and they knew the next step would be a confrontation that was far from over. The protagonists' frustration boiled over as they hung up the phone. The HOA had made it clear they weren't going to get involved, and it left the protagonist feeling both powerless and angry that Karen had won this round. And now it seemed like there was no one left to turn to after all the research they had done. The law was clearly on their side, but without the HOA's support, they knew they couldn't handle this alone. It wasn't just the camera that had upset them anymore. It was the principle of it all. The Karen had imposed herself into their life, with no regard for their privacy or their boundaries, and now it felt like everyone was standing aside and letting her get away with it. The more the protagonists thought about it, the angrier they became. They had tried to be reasonable. They had approached the Karen with kindness. They had gone through the HOA as the rules of the community dictated, and still the Karen had done whatever she wanted without consequence. There was only one option left. The protagonists knew it was time to take things to the next level. They needed to confront the Karen face to face. They had to let her know that they weren't afraid to go further. If necessary, this wasn't just about a camera anymore. It was about standing up for themselves and taking back control of their space. The following morning, the protagonists put on their shoes and head outside. Their heart raced with every step. They knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy, and it could get ugly, but they couldn't back down anymore. They had to take action. The Karen was in her front yard trimming the bushes again, her eyes scanning the neighborhood as she worked. When she saw the protagonist walking toward her, she paused for a moment and then continued trimming without acknowledging them. The protagonist took a deep breath and called out, "We need to talk." The Karen didn't stop trimming, but her posture tensed slightly as she turned to face them. "What's this about now?" she asked in a tone that was dismissive yet guarded. "I'm not going to let this go," the protagonist said, their voice steady but firm. "That camera in your backyard is an invasion of my privacy, and I'm done being ignored about it." The Karen paused as if considering their words, but then shook her head as if dismissing the complaint entirely. "I told you already, it's for security purposes," she said curtly. "I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of nothing." The protagonist's anger flared at the casual dismissal. They stepped closer, their voice rising. "It's not nothing, it's illegal. You've crossed a line, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like she might actually back down, but instead she crossed her arms and stared at the protagonist coldly. "You think you're going to scare me with threats?" she said, her tone now dripping with contempt. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The words stung, but the protagonist refused to back down. They met her gaze unwaveringly. "You've made a huge mistake, and I'm not going to let you intimidate me anymore," they said firmly. "If you don't take that camera down, I'll take this to the authorities, and I'll make sure they know exactly what you're doing." The Karen's lips curled into a tight smile as she leaned in slightly. "Go ahead. I'll tell them. It's all for the neighborhood's safety. You won't have a leg to stand on." The confrontation reached a stalemate, neither side willing to budge. The protagonist's heart raced as the realization hit them like a cold wave. They were in a standoff now, and the Karen wasn't going to just roll over. But the protagonist wasn't done yet. They had made up their mind. They would fight this to the end, and they knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were prepared for whatever came next, because they had already lost too much to let someone like the Karen have the final word. The confrontation with the Karen left the protagonist shaken but more determined than ever. They had reached a deadlock, and the Karen had made it clear she wasn't going to back down easily. The words echoed in their mind. "You don't know who you're dealing with." The Karen had a certain confidence, like she was untouchable, and it fueled a fire of defiance in the protagonist. They weren't going to let her intimidate them into silence. The next morning, the protagonist woke up with a sense of purpose, no more waiting for the HOA to step in or hoping the Karen would see reason. It was time to take matters into their own hands. They knew the legal route was their only option now, and they weren't about to let the Karen get away with this. The protagonists spent the day gathering everything they needed. They pulled out their research about surveillance laws and privacy rights in their state, and made copies of the photos they had taken of the camera pointing into their yard. They made a list of every single incident that had made them feel violated from the first time they noticed the Karen peeking over the fence, to the increasingly intrusive presence of the camera. They wanted to be as thorough as possible. That afternoon, the protagonist called their lawyer explaining the situation and how the HOA had refused to act. They detailed everything from the Karen's actions to the lack of support from the community association. The lawyer listened carefully before speaking. "This is a clear violation of privacy." They said, "You've done the right thing by gathering evidence and contacting me. I'll help you take it from here." The relief the protagonist felt was immediate, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of anticipation. They knew this battle wasn't going to be quick or easy, but now they had the legal backing to go forward. The lawyer explained the next steps. They would send a formal cease and desist letter to the Karen demanding that the camera be taken down within a specific period of time. If she didn't comply, the next step would be filing a formal lawsuit for privacy invasion and illegal surveillance. The Karen would be forced to answer in court, and there would be consequences. The protagonist spent the next few days preparing for the legal process, trying to stay calm, despite the overwhelming anxiety that came with knowing this was about to escalate. They were no longer just dealing with a nosy neighbor. They were heading into a full-blown legal battle. A week later, the cease and desist letter was sent to the Karen's address. The protagonist watched anxiously as the days passed, wondering how she would react. Would she comply, or would she double down and escalate the situation further? The Karen didn't disappoint. When she received the letter, she was furious. The protagonist could practically hear her ranting from across the fence. When she noticed the Karen glaring at them from her window the next day, the protagonist knew something was about to happen. A few hours later, the Karen marched over to their house. This time, she was seething with rage, her fists clenched at her sides. "You think you can just tell me what to do?" she shouted as soon as she reached the front door. "You have no idea who you're messing with." The protagonist stood their ground, heart pounding but determined. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," they said quietly. "And I won't stop until that camera is down, and you understand that this is not your neighborhood to control." The Karen's face twisted in fury. "We'll see about that," she hissed before storming off back toward her house. The protagonist felt a shiver run down their spine, but they stood tall. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back now. The battle was officially on, and the Karen wasn't going to make it easy, but neither were they. The confrontation with the Karen left the protagonist with a sense of dread and determination that gnawed at them. The Karen was furious, and the look in her eyes made it clear this wasn't going to end quietly. As the days passed, the tension in the air thickened with each passing hour. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the Karen was watching them even more closely now. Every time they stepped outside, they'd find her peering out from behind her curtains or standing by the fence, her eyes trained on their every move. The next morning, a letter arrived from the Karen's lawyer. It was a long and aggressive document, accusing the protagonist of harassment and demanding that the cease and desist letter be retracted immediately. The Karen's lawyer claimed that the protagonist had misinterpreted the intentions of the camera, and that there was no legal basis for the complaint. They threatened legal action of their own if the protagonist did not comply with their demands. The protagonist felt a wave of anxiety crash over them. As they read the letter, it was clear that the Karen had no intention of backing down, and now she was using every trick in the book to make them feel small, to intimidate them into submission. But the protagonist wasn't afraid. They had come too far to let her scare them. They called their lawyer immediately and explained the new development. The lawyer remained calm and reassured them that this was a typical tactic when someone felt cornered. "Don't worry," the lawyer said. "This is just a bluff. They're trying to intimidate you into giving up. You have all the legal grounds to stand your ground." With newfound resolve, the protagonist knew they had to continue pushing forward. They refused to let the Karen's threats and the legal wrangling shake them. They had done their homework, they had gathered evidence, and they had a clear case. But they also knew that things were about to get much more complicated. Over the next few weeks, the protagonist continued to feel the weight of the Karen's presence in the neighborhood. The camera still hung above their backyard, looming down like a silent observer. It was a constant reminder of how far the Karen was willing to go to assert control and invade their privacy. Then came the day the court documents arrived. The protagonist felt a cold chill run through them as they looked at the official summons for the lawsuit the Karen had filed against them, accusing them of defamation and harassment over their public complaint. She had made it clear she was willing to take things to court to teach them a lesson, and this time it was real. The reality of the situation hit hard as the protagonist realized this was no longer just a neighborly dispute. This was a battle that would play out in a courtroom with stakes that were far higher than they had anticipated. The idea of going to court terrified them, but there was no turning back now. The protagonists spent the next few days in a whirlwind of preparation with their lawyer. They gathered all the evidence they had from the camera's placement to their communications with the Karen and the HOA. They compiled every detail into a comprehensive case, hoping that when the time came they would be ready to fight. The court date approached, and with it the rising tension in the protagonist's chest. Every new development felt like a step deeper into a conflict that had once seemed so small. Now, it was a battle over their rights, their privacy, and their peace of mind. As the day loomed closer, the protagonist couldn't help but wonder how far the Karen was willing to go to win, and what it would take to finally put an end to this nightmare. They knew one thing for certain: they had come too far to back down. Now the fight for their privacy was about to enter its most intense phase yet. The day of the court hearing arrived with a weight that pressed down on the protagonist's chest like a heavy stone. As they entered the courthouse, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. The buzz of conversations filled the hallways, but it felt like a distant hum as the protagonist's mind raced with thoughts of the upcoming battle. They had never imagined their peaceful life in the neighborhood would lead them here, yet here they were ready to stand up for their rights. Their lawyer met them in the lobby, offering a reassuring smile, but even they couldn't hide the tension in their eyes. It was clear this case was going to be difficult. The Karen was a force to be reckoned with, and her legal team had already proven to be aggressive. The protagonists tried to steady their nerves, but doubt lingered in the back of their mind. The courtroom was larger than they expected, and the judge looked stern as they entered, taking their seats. The Karen was already there, her posture stiff. As she sat with her lawyer, she glanced over at the protagonist, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that was both triumphant and menacing. The protagonists swallowed hard and forced themselves to look away. The hearing began with the judge asking both sides to present their cases. The Karen's lawyer went first, laying out a narrative that painted the protagonist as an unreasonable neighbor who was trying to make an issue out of nothing. They emphasized the Karen's intention to maintain security for the neighborhood and claimed that the camera had never been positioned to invade anyone's privacy. It was simply a precautionary measure, they argued. The protagonist's lawyer responded by outlining the legal principles surrounding privacy and surveillance laws, citing specific examples of cases where cameras directed at private property without consent were found to be illegal. They presented the photographs of the camera facing the protagonist's backyard, along with copies of emails and letters exchanged with the HOA. The evidence was clear. The Karen's lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, claiming it was circumstantial and unimportant, but the judge wasn't convinced. They asked pointed questions about the specific placement of the camera and whether the Karen had informed the neighbors about the surveillance system. The Karen was forced to admit that she hadn't notified anyone and hadn't considered the impact it might have on her neighbors' sense of privacy. The protagonist sat quietly during the back and forth, taking in the proceedings with a sense of disbelief. The Karen's defense seemed weak and full of holes, but the protagonist knew that this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over, and they still had to prove that the Karen's actions had caused them harm. As the day wore on, the tension in the courtroom built. The Karen's lawyer continued to press their case, while the protagonist's lawyer methodically laid out the arguments for the violation of privacy. It felt like a tug of war, with both sides pulling in different directions, each trying to gain the upper hand. When it was finally the protagonist's turn to speak, they stood up slowly, their heart pounding in their chest. They had never been one to speak in front of crowds, but now they knew they had no choice. This was their chance to make their case to the judge and to everyone in the room. I never wanted this to go this far. The protagonists began, their voice shaking slightly, but growing steadier as they continued. I simply wanted to enjoy my home and my privacy without feeling like I was being watched. Every moment I spent in my backyard was under the shadow of that camera, and it made me feel violated. They paused, looking directly at the Karen. This isn't about being a bad neighbor or making trouble. It's about my right to feel safe in my own space. There was a brief silence in the courtroom. As the words hung in the air, the Karen didn't meet the protagonist's gaze. Instead, her eyes were fixed on the table in front of her, but the judge's gaze never wavered from the protagonist. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you," they said. "We'll reconvene tomorrow, after considering the evidence and the statements." The hearing was adjourned for the day, and as the protagonist left the courtroom, they couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They had said their piece, but now they had to wait for the judge's decision. They knew the outcome was still uncertain, but they had given it everything they had, and for the first time in weeks, they felt like they were in control of their own story. The next day arrived with an anxious stillness in the protagonist's chest. They hadn't slept well the night before, their mind replaying every moment of the hearing, wondering if they had done enough, wondering if they had said the right things, or if they had missed something important. Every possible scenario swirled in their head, but nothing could prepare them for what was about to happen. As they walked into the courthouse, the air felt thick with anticipation. The courtroom was packed with people, and the judge was already seated. As the protagonists took their place, their lawyer beside them, there was a quiet murmur in the room. As the Karen entered with her lawyer, her eyes locked onto the protagonist. But there was no smugness this time, just a coldness that seemed to fill the space between them. The protagonist didn't look at her. Instead, they focused on the judge, who had yet to speak. The judge cleared their throat and addressed the room in a steady voice. "We have reviewed the evidence presented and the statements made by both parties," they began. "After careful consideration of the facts, it is clear that the defendant's actions have indeed violated the privacy rights of the plaintiff." The words hit the protagonist like a wave crashing over them. It took a moment for the meaning to settle in, but when it did, they felt a surge of relief and disbelief. It was official, the judge had sided with them. The camera in question was positioned in a manner that clearly infringed upon the plaintiff's right to privacy. The judge continued, "Furthermore, the defendant's failure to inform her neighbors of the installation or to consider the impact of her actions shows a disregard for their privacy." The Karen's face twisted with a mix of anger and disbelief, but the protagonist couldn't look away from the judge, listening intently to every word the judge was saying. As a result of this violation, the court orders that the camera be removed immediately and that the defendant pay damages to the plaintiff for emotional distress caused by the invasion of privacy, the judge concluded. The room was silent for a moment as the words sank in, and then the protagonist felt a wave of emotion flood through them. It was a mixture of relief and vindication. All the stress and worry of the past weeks seemed to melt away in an instant. It was over. The Karen had lost. The Karen stood up quickly, her lawyer moving beside her. As they whispered urgently, the protagonist could hear her muttering under her breath, but the words didn't matter anymore. The judge had spoken. As the courtroom emptied, the protagonist felt their legs shaking. As they stood up, it was hard to believe that they had actually won. After all the sleepless nights, the stress, the uncertainty, they had come out on top. Walking out of the courthouse, the protagonists took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off their shoulders. They had fought for their privacy and their peace of mind, and now they had it back. The camera was gone. The Karen had been ordered to pay for the distress she had caused, and for the first time in months, they felt free. When they reached their car, their lawyer turned to them with a smile. "You did great," they said. "This was the right call." The protagonist smiled back, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of relief, of someone who had been through a battle and had come out the other side still standing. The drive home felt longer than usual, but in the best way. The sun was setting, and the protagonist felt a sense of calm settle over them. As they pulled into their driveway for the first time in what felt like forever, they could finally relax. But they knew one thing for certain: they had taken a stand, and even though the fight had been difficult and exhausting, it had been worth it to protect what mattered most, their right to live in peace. In the weeks that followed, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction every time they stepped into their backyard. They had won, they had fought back against an invasion of their privacy, and now they could finally enjoy their space without the constant dread of being watched. The Karen had removed the camera as per the court order, and the sense of unease that had settled over their home had finally lifted. But life wasn't without its lingering effects. The neighborhood still buzzed with whispers of the legal battle. Some neighbors supported the protagonist, saying it was about time someone stood up to the Karen. Others were more cautious, unsure about taking sides in the drama that had unfolded around them. The protagonist felt a mix of emotions, seeing the reactions, but ultimately they didn't care what others thought. They had won their peace, and that was all that mattered. The Karen kept a low profile after the verdict, avoiding eye contact with the protagonist. Whenever they crossed paths, she never apologized for what she had done, and continued to act as though the whole situation had been blown out of proportion. But the protagonist didn't care about her version of events anymore. The court had spoken, and the Karen's arrogance had been brought to an end. There were moments of doubt in the aftermath, when the protagonist thought about how close they had come to losing everything. The stress of the fight had taken a toll on them more than they cared to admit. The sleepless nights, the constant worry had eaten away at their energy, and at times they wondered if it had been worth it. But looking at their quiet backyard, watching the sun set over their garden, they knew that it had been. They found themselves enjoying the little things again, the peaceful mornings, the warm evenings, when they could sit on the porch and feel the breeze against their skin without constantly scanning the yard for signs of the camera. It was a new beginning, a chance to reconnect with the simplicity of life. In the months that followed, the protagonist noticed a change in how they approached the world. They had learned the importance of standing up for themselves and protecting their space, but they had also learned the cost of that fight, the emotional toll it took on them, and the relationships that had been strained as a result. But as time passed, the protagonist found themselves more confident, more self-assured, and the lessons they had learned stayed with them. They knew that they could face whatever challenges came their way, because they had already faced one of the toughest battles of their life and come out on top. The Karen eventually moved away, though it was unclear whether the court case had influenced her decision or if it was just a coincidence. The neighborhood felt quieter without her presence, but the protagonist didn't let that affect them. The peace they had won was their own, and no one could take that away. On a quiet afternoon, as the protagonists sat in their backyard sipping coffee, they realized that the victory had been more than just about the camera or the lawsuit. It had been about reclaiming their life, their privacy, and their sense of security. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, they felt a deep sense of contentment, because they had learned that sometimes standing up for what's right meant more than winning the fight. It meant finding peace in the aftermath.